What do you do when a river starts to poison its citizens? Well, in the mid to late 1800s, the engineers of Chicago pulled off one of the boldest engineering feats in US history. They reversed the flow of the Chicago River. Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Hahn, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. To help us explain how and why the Chicago River reversed its flow, I'm joined by Mr. Dick Lanyon, who is the former executive director of the MWRD. If you guys remember the MWRD, that's because we did do an episode a few weeks ago where they gave us an inside look at one of the world's largest wastewater treatment plants. Anyways, let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Lanyon.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do or did in the past?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Chicago. It's my home city, and actually, I was near the Chicago River when I was growing up. And after my engineering education at the University of Illinois, I worked for a consultant for a couple of years doing water work, and then I switched and worked for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which we call MWRD, for 48 years. And the last 4.5 years I was there, I was the executive director. So that was a pretty big responsibility. And then I've been retired for 15 years, but I'm still active in the water business.
That's great to hear. So thank you for that. And I want to start off with some context. For our listeners who probably aren't familiar with, the Chicago area or the subject as a whole, what was going on with the Chicago River in the 1800s?
Well, we have to start like early in the 1800s when the settlers first arrived. And the Chicago area is a large, flat plain along the shore of Lake Michigan. And it's very marshy here. Few sandy high ground, but for the most part, mostly marsh. So as people began to settle here, they were having problems with cholera in the early part of the 1800s, and cholera being a waterborne disease. That's because they were, putting their waste on the land, and it wasn't soaking into the ground or anything, and they were getting their water supply out of shallow wells or something. All right, so around the middle of the century, the city fathers decided they needed to raise some of the streets so they could install sewers and drain the land and remove the public health hazard of so much water lying around. Well, that was successful, and they hired a man from Boston named Ellis Chesbrough to lay out a sewer system, and then the city started to build the sewers. That was helpful, but it began to pollute the Chicago River because the sewage from the homes and so forth was going directly into the river. Mr. Chesbrough was a very innovative guy, and of course, by putting the pollution in the river flowed into Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan is the source of the water supply. So that was not a good situation. Most of the pollution was along the shoreline, and Mr. Chesbrough innovated a 2-mile long tunnel under the lake bed and a water intake 2 miles offshore to bring in cleaner water. And that survived for a while. But then in 1871, we had a huge fire in Chicago, the Great Chicago Fire, which destroyed most of the city. And of course, that put the pollution problem kind of on the back burner while the city rebuilt. And then in the 1880s, the citizens began to get concerned about the public health problem with polluting the water supply. And a big storm in August of in 1885 flushed a lot of water out into the lake. So the threat was definitely there that would cause a public health epidemic. Fortunately, the onshore winds kept the polluted water, away from that 2 mile offshore intake. But the threat was alive, and people began to act, and they got the city to uh, perform a study. And this time, by this time, Mr. Chesbrough had died, but they hired another engineer from Philadelphia who came in and did a study and came up with the idea of reversing the flow of the river. Now, Mr. Chesbrough had thought about that earlier, but then with the fire, it kind of got forgotten.
I see. So when you guys originally got the water 2 miles offshore from Lake Michigan and then had that, pump or like had that water come through a pipe to the residents of Chicago, is that how it worked back then?
Yes, yes, yeah.
And
But
when
yeah,
yeah,
the city had developed a water supply system with the offshore intake and then a pumping station onshore that would distribute water through pipes to all of the homes and businesses.
and then while the fire destroyed the city, this problem was sort of just left behind while the city focused on rebuilding.
Yeah, the fire did not destroy the water tower or the pumping station.
Mhm.
Those two structures survived the fire. Very fortunate for the city.
So the solution to reverse the river, it was like originally by the Chesbrough guy, but then he died, and so some guy from Philadelphia came in and said, hey, let's reverse the flow of the river. Is that how it works?
Yeah, that was Rudolph Herring. And he came up with three ideas to deal with the um, pollution in the river. First of all, he suggested moving the water intake farther north along the shore and diverting all of the sewage to the south, which was the idea was that there was a counterclockwise current in Lake Michigan here, and that would sweep the pollution away from the intake. However, it was known that if the wind shifted, the currents might shift, and so that wouldn't be a sustainable solution. The second idea was to pump the sewage out of the city to farmland, which was practiced in some communities, but with Chicago being a big city, that would be a lot of sewage going on a lot of farmland. And of course, people outside the city didn't like that idea, so that didn't float. And then his third idea was to reverse the flow of the river. Now, you would think it's not easy to reverse the flow of the river because in most parts of the world, rivers have their headwaters in high ground and they flows downstream into a water
Mm.
body or the ocean. But here in Chicago, we're sitting on a subcontinental divide 10 miles away from the Lake Michigan shoreline. And on the other side of that divide, the land falls off. So if you could just cut a canal long enough to cross that divide, you could easily reverse the flow of the river.
I see. So the appeal was that, at first it doesn't seem possible. Like, hey, nobody's ever reversed the flow of a river, but then you realize Chicago's, right next to you said it was like a divide.
Yes, it's a subcontinental watershed divide. The other side of the divide, all the water flows toward the Mississippi River.
I see. And the Mississippi River, did you guys connect? Was the idea to connect it to the Mississippi River?
Well, we didn't have to go that far. We just had to get across the divide to the Des Plaines River, which does
Oh,
flows into the
that one flows
Illinois
into the
River, and the
Mississippi.
Illinois River flows into the Mississippi.
I see. And was there, when residents heard about this, what were their thoughts? Were there like opposition to this or?
Well, of course, in Chicago, there was no opposition. They wanted to clean up this public health threat and the dirty, smelly Chicago River. There was concern downstate in Illinois with wastewater and sewage coming from Chicago. Uh, and the city couldn't do this on their own. They had to get approval from the state government at the time. There was no federal interest at this time in water resources. So we didn't have to get any approvals from the federal government. So when the citizens in Chicago and the city government went down to our state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, with a proposal and some legislation, it met some opposition from the downstate people. However, politics being what it is, you negotiate and you trade ideas and so forth. And what satisfied the people downstate was, number one, make the canal navigable so that they could use it to ship their farm products up into the city and ship supplies down to the rural areas in downstate Illinois. The second thing was having the Chicago area, the city, be liable for any damages caused by additional flow from the city. Now, the additional flow would not just be the sewage, but at the time, there was no proven technology for treating sewage on a large scale. And what a lot of cities did is they just diluted sewage with more water. And that was the idea in Chicago. You would reverse the flow of the river and draw water out of Lake Michigan to dilute the sewage. Okay, well, more water might have caused problems downstate, so you had to have the city accept the liability. And then the third thing was they wanted to have be sure the city did the job right, and so before they could put this reversed canal system into operation, it had to receive the approval of the governor, and the governor was to be advised by people he appointed from downstate Illinois. Well, in the next session of the State General Assembly, the legislation was successful, and that was in the year 1889. And that act formed a new unit of government called a sanitary district. So the first name of what is now the MWRD was the Sanitary District of Chicago. And it had to be approved by referendum. Well, in the city, there was no problem getting a vote to approve the new district. In fact, the vote was 300-1. For every one opposition, there were 300 yes votes. So everybody said, let's go with this, folks. And that all came together within that same year, 1889. And in the following year, there was a couple of legal challenges, but those were dispensed with at the state Supreme Court by the middle of 1890. So then the district could do business. And took a couple of years to get started, but yeah, the first construction was started in 1892.
I see. So how long did this whole process take from the moment the residents heard about reversing the river to actually getting this project approved?
Well, it was only a matter of about 3 years. The recommendation from this engineer, Rudolph Herring from Philadelphia, was in 1886, and the General Assembly approved the formation of the new district in 1889. So 3 years.
That's pretty fast considering, all the negotiations that had to happen, especially with the states downstream of the river where you guys were just sending their waste. So I guess that is 3 years was considered pretty fast back then.
Yeah, there must have been a lot of arm twisting and horse trading.
Yeah. And I want to talk about the actual construction. What did it take to physically reverse the flow of the river? What exactly did the city do?
Well, it was a big job. First of all, you had to build a new canal 28 miles in length. Okay. In addition to that, you had to improve a part of the Chicago River because of the additional flow coming from Lake Michigan. So add 5 miles for that. And then at the other end of the canal, you had to improve the Des Plaines River going through the city of Joliet because of this additional flow. So we had a 38-mile long job here. And the toughest part was 15 miles of that new canal went through solid rock.
Oh,
So um, that was thought to be the toughest part. And when they started in 1892, they said, well, we're going to finish this in 4 years. Well,
no, right?
yeah. Now, the way this was done was, at the time, there had been a lot of canal building in the eastern part of the United States, and of course, a lot of railroad building. So the engineers that were doing work in Chicago were basically trained with canal work in the east and railroad building. Um, so going through that rock, 15 miles of rock, they had to drill holes and load them with dynamite and then blast the rock, uh, and remove the rock. And that section of work was 35 feet deep and 160 feet wide, and that distance over 15 miles. Now, the remainder of the new canal, um, the other 13 miles, that was just excavated through um, clay, or what we call glacial till, a mixture of rocks and soil and dirt that was laid down by the glaciers. So that was done with steam shovels, and um, sometimes um, animal power was used to move carts with the excavated spoil, or they would use small steam engines and railroad cars. And everything in those days had to be, all the construction equipment had to be on rails, because we didn't have large pneumatic tires, we didn't have diesel engines. So all you had was human power, animal power, and coal fired steam power.
And back then, today these days to drill through bedrock, you have like these huge machines that can just create tunnels, right? But I guess back then, all you had was dynamite and some shovels, right?
Yeah, it's a lot different. And as I said, the technology was not that revolutionary, because people that had done this had been building railroads and, making tunnels through mountains for railroads and excavating canals. Anyway, but it was a big job nevertheless. Now, I said that they expected this work to be finished in 4 years. Well, a couple of contractors were on the ball and they got their work done in 3 years, and that was really
Wow.
remarkable. However, not all contractors were that successful, and contracting being what it is, there were disputes. There were disputes over the type of excavation. If there was too much rock, they wanted extra payments and so forth. So the actual construction work was more than 4 years. Almost, it was 7.5 years to be precise. So the work was finished by the end of 1899. And of course, by that time, the citizens, their patience had been exhausted. They were waiting for this to be done, and it was dragging on. And of course, who paid for this? The citizens paid for it. There was no federal money. There was no state money. Everybody had to pay more taxes to get this work done, but they were willing to do it because they wanted to end this public health problem.
I see. And the people that were actually like doing the digging, all this work, was this like a volunteer type system where anyone who wanted to help out would get paid, or were citizens like forced to help out with this project?
No, there was no volunteer work or anything like that. This was all done by contractors. The engineers divided up the work into about 1 mile increments, and the contracts were advertised, and bids were taken, and then they would award the job to the most responsible, lowest bidder. Maybe, but some of the engineers and the political leaders didn't agree, and sometimes politics got in the way, and maybe the recommended contractor was outdone by a contractor who has more political influence. But anyway, that was all part of the problem of getting this job done. Now, the work was done largely with immigrant labor. at the time, people didn't commute to work. If you would walk to work.
Mhm.
Well, you couldn't walk out along this long canal, so each contractor would set up a camp, and the laborers would live on site in this camp and work during the day, and then just go back to the camp at night. Now, being immigrant labor, some of which was from Ireland, some was from Germany, some was from Italy, someone was from Romania, wherever. There were some ethnic differences, and in the off hours, there might be a little alcohol consumed, and then there would be maybe some fights between the
Mhm.
Italians and the Germans, or the Polish and the Italians, whatever. So the sanitary district had to set up a police force to maintain order along the route of this canal construction. And they also had to set up some health guards. These camps had to be inspected. You had to
Mhm.
be sure that the laborers had proper bedding and proper food. Couldn't cut costs by taking it out of the hide of the workers. So it was a lot of responsibility to keep this project going, in addition to the construction.
I see. And what were the living conditions like? Were they like crowded, crammed, dirty? Is that how the camps were?
Well, I tried to make living conditions for the workers to be, reasonably um, spacious, and everybody had their own bunk, and you had a little locker for you to store your extra goods and so forth. Um, I guess it must have been a good life for some people, but uh, there's not a lot of detail about the everyday worker on this project that's available. So we don't really know what it was like.
So you don't know any there's not a lot of information on like the working conditions or
Yeah, I haven't ever been able to find any information about accidents and deaths and so forth on the site. But when you're dealing with dynamite on those 15 miles,
yeah, I can
uh,
imagine there were some
there
deaths.
had to be some accidents,
Hmm.
and sometimes a steam boiler would blow up. It would, whatever.
Yeah. You said these workers worked in, 1 mile increments. So, they'd live in the camp until they finished like 1 mile of digging and then they would go return home. Is that how it worked?
Well, yeah, each contractor was responsible for about a mile of work, and when they were finished, the job was done. Now, some of the immigrant laborers may have gone back to their country of origin, and some of them may have decided to stay. So it probably helped the Chicago area to grow a little bit. Um, but not too many people that lived in the city were willing to live out in these camps. So, as I said, most of the laborers were immigrants.
And what was the pay like for these immigrants? Was it like a low paying job?
Well, they did establish an 8-hour work day. There were provisions for additional compensation for overtime.
Hmm.
Um, and it was pretty fair. And at the time in Chicago, we were having a lot of labor problems with people at the stockyards and in the railroad business and so forth. And so the elected uh, people that ran the sanitary district were sensitive to the possibility for labor trouble. So they were making it reasonable for workers on these jobs, and requiring, as I said, the 8-hour day, and overtime pay and working conditions.
Mhm. And after this this job was done, what changed for Chicago? How long did it take for residents to notice these changes in water quality?
Well, remarkably, the change was instantaneous. Here's what happened. So at the end of 18, as the work was wrapping up in 1899, they had to deal with this provision to have the governor's approval. So They applied to the governor, and the governor appointed these three people from downstate to come up and inspect the work. And at the end of the year, the trustees of the sanitary district said, "Well, we could fill the canal. We got this 28-mile long canal sitting there empty. We could fill it while we're waiting for the governor to approve." Okay, so they on January 2nd of 1900, they pulled the plug up on the Chicago end of the canal and they let it fill. It took 12 days to fill. Well, that rate of flow was strong enough to reverse the flow in the river. And so on the morning of January 3rd, people walked down to the river and wonders. You could see the water was clear. You could see fish in the river. The water was being drawn in from the lake, bringing the fish with them. So this was a miracle. And it went on for 12 days. Well, then, the canal filled up and the flow stopped. And the governor still hadn't approved. Well, 3 days later, he finally said, okay, and they lowered the gate at the far end of the canal, and the water flowed. The river was irrevocably reversed. And so the river stayed clean after that. Now, of course, sewage was coming into the river, so it was clean up there by the lake where the water was coming in from the lake. But as you went downstream, of course, more sewage was added. And, by the time you get down to Joliet, it wasn't a very wholesome river. For the first 10 years after the flow was reversed, the added water was a benefit downstate. But then as the sewage was moving slower than the water, of course, and as that was moving downstream, it began to coat the bottom of the Illinois River with these sewage solids and kind of destroyed the ecology of the Illinois River. And that went on for several decades in the 1900s until sewage treatment was improved up in Chicago and in other cities along the river, so that by the end of the 1900s, the Illinois River was experiencing recovery. And that was at the same time that the Clean Water Act had come into being, and everybody was building sewage treatment plants and trying to restore the integrity of our nation's waters.
I see. And when you guys were digging this canal, was it like, did you guys start from the middle and then gradually go towards the two ends, and then you finally dug that final part? That's when the water started coming in? Or
no, that was the work was done simultaneously. They would award these contracts, for 1 mile. So you'd have contractors working all along the length of the canal, all at the same time. And, some contractors would finish early and they were off the job, and then the canal would just sit there and wait while work was finishing on other sections.
And when you guys released the Chicago River, was it like a dam that opened and then the water started flowing in, or how did that work?
Well, up at the upper end of the canal, which was on the southwest side of the city in a neighborhood called Bridgeport, there was a dike, a little earthen barrier between the south branch of the Chicago River and the new canal. And so when they were ready to fill the canal, they just had to breach that dike and let the water flow into the new canal.
When you guys released this canal, things weren't too bad for the residents down south. I know you mentioned that the sludge started building up at the bottom of the river, but they didn't complain too much. How was it like
downstate?
Yeah, downstate and down.
Yeah, there was a lot of complaints about the smell and the well, first of all, there were a lot of lawsuits. As I said earlier, the district had to accept liability for any damage as well. A lot of farmers along the river would claim that the added water flooded their fields and that their crops didn't grow or whatever. And so there was a lot of lawsuits filed by landowners along the river um, that the sanitary district had to defend and make payouts and so forth. And you can imagine that, some people would some of their claims were a little extravagant or um, exaggerated, maybe even phony, whatever. So that was a big challenge for the sanitary district. And then there was the pollution, which it was a pretty good fishery on the Illinois River, which was virtually eliminated by the pollution from Chicago.
I see. And were there any unintended consequences that Chicago didn't anticipate?
Um, well, I mentioned the litigation and so forth.
Hmm.
Um, the navigation system was quite improved because there had been a small canal called the Illinois and Michigan Canal that was almost put out of business by the railroads. But with the new canal, uh, larger boats could navigate the system. And so that was a good outcome. There was an improvement in navigation. And eventually, this whole channel system from Chicago all the way down to near St. Louis
Hmm.
was part of a federal project called the Illinois Waterway. And that was a good thing. Now, in the 1950s, the federal government was in cooperation with Canada to improve the St. Lawrence Seaway. And locks were built on the St. Lawrence River, and the locks around Niagara Falls were improved. And so more ocean-going vessels were coming into the Great Lakes. And along with ocean-going vessels were some invasive species. So pretty soon we were finding invasive species coming through the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes into the Chicago area, into the Lake Michigan near Chicago, and then going through the canal system and getting out into the Mississippi River. Well, that wasn't good. We had this zebra mussel. It was the most troublesome because the zebra mussel would build up on water intakes and virtually close a water intake off. So that was a negative. More recently, I would say 20 years ago, we saw these Asian carp come upriver, up the Mississippi River and up the Illinois River. And where did they come from? Well, they were imported from China because they eat vegetation, and they were to control the vegetation growing in fish farms in the southern states. Well, nature being what it is, a little rainstorm and some of those fish farms maybe overflowed, and these critters got into the natural rivers, and they were moving up the Mississippi and up the Illinois, and there was a concern that they would move up into the Great Lakes. Well, that concern never materialized, probably because the canal system up in the Chicago area didn't have any habitat, didn't have any food. It was an artificial canal system.
Hmm.
And, the fish didn't want to come up there. And it wasn't the best water quality in the first place. So that was another unintended consequence. We're dealing with the invasion of Asian carp, but it's mostly an Illinois River problem. It hasn't become a Chicago problem, and we hope it never does.
Is this where you guys? I think I heard somewhere like on like the Illinois on some canal along the river. You guys like electrocuted the water. Like you guys have like electrocuted gates. Is that?
Well, yeah, that was the first technology that was installed, and that was actually installed because of these invasive species that were coming through the Great Lakes. And in Congress, the people in Ohio sponsored legislation directing the Corps of Engineers to build some sort of a control mechanism in the canal system here in Chicago. And that type of technology was called the electrical barrier. And as I said, it was installed to stop a little critter um, from the moving from the Great Lakes into the Mississippi River. But by the time they got it built, we had the carp coming up the other way. So this electrical barrier kind of worked in both ways um, to prevent the movement of invasive species. Now, it wasn't perfect because if a big barge was going through, some fish could get dragged with it. And it worked when the flow wasn't disturbed. But as I said, when a barge went through, then some invasive species could be dragged through, either going upstream or going downstream.
Mhm.
So that electrical barrier went in, um, like 20 years ago, and is still there, still working. And now the Corps of Engineers has a new plan to rebuild one of the navigation locks just south of Joliet on the Des Plaines River. That will be a modern technology to trap and keep the Asian carp from coming upstream.
I see. And is the concern for Asian carp is that they'll come in and start eating like the local fish that live there? What's the concern for
Well,
them?
the Asian carp are bottom feeders, and they're very voracious. And the fear is that they'll destroy the habitat that the sport fisheries uh, rely on. So, I mean, we've already seen changes in the Great Lakes because of the invasive species that have come in from the Atlantic Ocean. The lamprey eel was a big problem,
Mhm.
wiping out trout, lake trout, and whitefish in the Great Lakes. And they're controlled by um, applying pesticide to kill the larvae and avoid the growth of new lamprey eels up in the upper areas, upper watersheds where the lamprey eels will lay their eggs and so forth. So, yeah, you know, it's a complication that we have to deal with.
I see. So, here we are over 100 years later after the Chicago River has been reversed. What's the state of the river today?
Well, the state of the river is pretty good. Um, it's we have to most of the water in the system is effluent from our water reclamation plants. You were talking earlier about being at the Stickney
Yeah,
plant.
the
Well, there's
Stickney
two
plant.
other huge plants, not as big as Stickney, but so those three plants are most of the water in the canal system. And of course, that water, it comes from Lake Michigan, and it goes through homes and businesses, and then it becomes sewage, and then it goes through the process of being
Yeah.
reclaimed and into the canal system. Um, Now, with the new water quality standards, there has to be very good uh, treatment processes used to reclaim that water. And so the Chicago River is a recreational paradise today. Um, People kayak on it. There's a lot of excursion boats. People take architectural tours on the waterway where you look up at the buildings that have been built in the downtown area along the river and all the different architects that have been involved and design concepts and so forth. So it's a very popular amenity, and we have this beautiful river walk along the south side of the Chicago River, all the way from the lakefront over around the business district. Um, and the river walk during the warmer weather is just alive every evening with people
Mhm.
stopping off on their way home and whatever.
And random question. I know I see on TV you guys in Chicago for like Patrick's Day, you guys like dye the river green. That can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, that has been going on for a long time. Chicago um, has a large Irish population, and um, I don't know who got the idea to do this, but they started dyeing the river. Must have been 50 years ago, um, or for St. Patty's Day, and they're um, the plumbers union handles this. They get out there in some outboard motor uh, boats and put dye in the river, and then they just buzz around and mix it up real good, and then it, the raw Chicago River doesn't flow very fast, so it sits there for several days, and it's a part of the feature and the celebration of St. Patrick's Day.
Is it food coloring or what's the green? What is it?
Pardon?
Is it food coloring that they use to dye the river, or is it some other dye?
They use a vegetable dye of some
Hmm.
type. It's not doesn't pollute anything,
Oh, I
doesn't
see. I
harm
see.
anything. I mean, some people call it visual pollution. They don't like it,
Some
but
people don't like it.
it doesn't harm any critters that are in the river that we know about.
And now that you guys don't dump your waste like directly into the Chicago River, it's much clearer than it was before.
Oh yes, yeah. When I was a kid growing up, uh, every time it rained, they'd be pumping all the rainwater and mixed with sewage into the river, and the river was really gross. Oh, you see grease balls floating down the river and everything. Well, you don't see that anymore. And the city of Chicago, and 50 surrounding suburbs all have combined sewers. It's the largest area of combined sewers, I think, probably in the world. Now, a combined sewer is where one pipe carries both sewage and, during wet weather, stormwater. So you have this mixture, and the sewer, when they get overloaded, they overflow. And where do they overflow to? They overflow to the
Chicago
waterway.
River.
We try to treat as much as we can at the reclamation plants, but everything you can't treat has to overflow. So the Clean Water Act came along and said no more combined sewer overflow. It took a few years, but we came up with another huge project uh, called the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan, or we commonly call it the Deep Tunnel,
Hmm.
where we have added supplementary capacity to the waterways with a huge tunnel system that's a couple 100 feet underground. And the overflow from the sewers goes down into that tunnel, and the tunnels have reservoirs to hold the water. So we hold all of the overflow until we can treat it at the water reclamation plants, and then the cleaned water is discharged to the waterways.
I mean, yeah, it's incredible to see, the Chicago River go from a river that was so polluted that it was once, poisoning its citizens out, and now to, a place where people can take hikes at night, enjoy the river. It's really amazing what you guys have done for the river. And it shows, the importance of our relationship with water. And before we wrap up this episode, is there anything you would like our listeners to know, about the river or just water or anything in general?
Well, I think I just wanted to say we're very proud of what we've done here. I think it's a demonstration of how the Clean Water Act has really helped to clean up our nation's waters. And as far as I know, we're going to keep improving it as much as we can. And even this year now, they've scheduled a swim in the Chicago River, um, where people who are experienced swimmers have to apply and be accepted. They're going to have a competition in the downtown area. It's going to be a 1 mile long swim. And of course, they can't eliminate boat traffic during this time, so they're going to have to protect these swimmers in part of the river while the boats have to be limited to the other part of the river. So, I mean, that's pretty remarkable that we're having a swimming event in the Chicago River.
Yeah, I mean, just 100 years ago, people were getting like poisoned just from drinking the water. Now you guys are having these events. It's amazing, really.
Yes,
Well, yeah. Oh, Mr. Lanyon, thank you for being a guest on H2O and Beyond today. It was a pleasure having you.
my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Alex.
Well, listeners, if you found this episode helpful, feel free to share it with your coworkers and friends. And also, please drop some suggestions in the Google form linked in the description below. If you guys want to learn more about the reversal of the Chicago River, I'll add some links in the description to the MWRD. Make sure to check out the link tree in the description as well to follow all the H2O and Beyond socials. I'm Alex. Thank you for listening to H2O and Beyond. Stay curious and stay hydrated.